I was sitting at the dinner table when my own son laughed and said, "This old man can barely stand. He forgets everything." The whole room went quiet, but the words cut deeper than any silence. I smiled faintly, though inside, it felt like my heart was being torn apart. After everything I sacrificed, his college tuition, the house he grew up in, this was what I had become to him. But I wasn't as helpless as they thought. I had been keeping records, letters, and even a secret document that could shatter their plans in one strike. So when they dragged me into court, expecting me to crumble, I reached into my coat and placed that envelope on the judge's desk. Do you want to know what was inside? And how it turned everything against them? Stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The evening air carried a crisp edge, the kind that reminded me autumn had finally settled into Ohio. From the window of my modest home in Columbus, I could see the garden Evelyn once tended so carefully, still holding on to late blooms. The roses had lost their summer brightness, yet they stood, much like I did, older, slower, but still standing. Retirement had given me quiet moments, and sometimes that quiet was both a comfort and a curse. My knees ached when I stood too long. My hands trembled when holding the newspaper. But my mind was still mine. I clung to that thought. Pride kept me steady, even when my body had other ideas. That Saturday evening, the family gathered for dinner. Darian, my only son, sat at the far end of the table, his voice carrying louder than anyone else's. He had always liked attention, but I had learned to live with it. The roast chicken steamed on the platter, mashed potatoes smoothed across the bowl, Irene's pie cooling on the counter. For a moment, it almost felt like the warmth of family had returned. Then Darian laughed, tilting his glass, and in that laugh came words that cut deeper than any knife. "This old man can barely stand," he said, smirking toward me. "He forgets everything. We really need to take care of his assets before something happens." The room chuckled, some politely, others nervously. My fork trembled against the plate, but I forced myself to stay still. My eyes dropped to the chicken, though the taste had long vanished from my mouth. Inside, a sting burned hotter than the oven had. It wasn't just a joke. It was a mark, a label pressed onto me in front of cousins, uncles, and friends. Pride told me not to react, not to let him see the wound. Silence, I believed, could be stronger than shouting, but silence that evening tasted like shame. Later that night, the house emptied and shadows stretched across the living room. The old armchair swallowed me as I sat, staring at the photograph of Evelyn on the mantel. She had been gone for years, but her steady eyes seemed to ask questions I could not answer. How had the boy we raised with love, with sacrifice, become a man who could speak of his father like that? I thought back to the nights I worked double shifts so Darian could finish college without debt, the loan I co-signed so he could buy his first home. Every sacrifice now seemed like a stone on my chest. Disbelief tangled with hurt until both felt the same. Sunday morning came with a clear sky. After church service, I lingered by the doors, exchanging greetings as neighbors filed out. That was when I heard it, a pair of whispers carried on the breeze. "Poor Malcolm," one woman said, her eyes soft with pity. "Renee told me he can't remember much anymore." Imagine forgetting where you put your own car keys in the freezer. They chuckled lightly, as if senility were a harmless comedy. My chest tightened. Renee, my daughter-in-law, the same woman who kissed my cheek at dinner, now planting seeds of doubt in the community. It wasn't just Darian's cruelty now, it was a partnership, a plan unfolding in shadows and in whispers. I walked home slower that day, every step heavier. By the time I reached the porch, the truth had settled in. This wasn't about a careless remark or gossip. It was groundwork. They were laying a foundation, brick by brick, of a story where I was the feeble old man, unfit to manage what was mine. And in that moment, clarity struck with the force of cold steel. This was not just gossip, it was war. The echo of Renee's voice still lingered in my head from that Sunday at church. Her words had spread like wildfire, and though she never said them to my face, I could feel their weight in every whisper behind me, in the polite but pitying looks that seemed to follow me around. I carried that sting home with me, and it stayed like a splinter under my skin. That afternoon, the family stopped by. The screen door banged open as Caleb ran inside, his little shoes clattering against the hardwood. His energy always lifted the room, a burst of life in the quiet house I kept since Evelyn passed. But before I could open my arms to him, his young voice rang out with a sentence that froze the air. "Dad said Grandpa forgets everything," he blurted, smiling, as if it were nothing more than a funny truth shared between adults. The words pierced deeper than Darian's had the week before. Hearing them from my son had been cruel enough, but echoed from my grandson's mouth, the sting was unbearable. My throat tightened, and I forced a thin smile, unwilling to let him see the hurt. He ran past me toward the kitchen, oblivious, leaving the silence behind him heavy as stone. I sat there, my mind racing. It wasn't Caleb's fault. He was repeating what he heard, what had been fed to him at the dinner table, spoken like fact. That was the true betrayal. Poison had been poured into his ears, and now, into mine. The thought haunted me. Would he grow up remembering me not as the man who taught him to fish, who built him a treehouse, but as some fragile, forgetful old man? Was my life's worth already being rewritten before his eyes? That night, I lay awake long after the house was quiet. The clock ticked in the hall, steady and unfeeling, while I wrestled with thoughts darker than I'd ever known. They weren't just talking about me. They were shaping the memory of me for the future, planting seeds in Caleb's mind that would outlive me. I feared being erased, my sacrifices buried under the story they were weaving. Grandpa, the senile man who couldn't stand on his own. A few days later, the trap tightened. I had forgotten to switch off the garage light one evening. A small thing, hardly worth a thought. When I came out the next morning, it was still glowing above the driveway. I muttered to myself and flipped it off, annoyed more by my own distraction than anything else. But Renee was there, pulling into the driveway with Darian beside her. Her sharp eyes caught it instantly. "The light's been on all night," she said, her voice pitched just high enough to carry. Then, turning to Darian with feigned concern, she added, "It's not safe for him to live alone anymore." They thought I couldn't hear, but every word landed like a hammer. A single light, one mistake, twisted into evidence that I couldn't manage my own life. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching their heads bend together in quiet agreement, while my dignity was chipped away piece by piece. Back inside, I sat in my old armchair, staring at the living room shelves lined with photographs and trophies of a life spent building, providing, protecting. I had been meticulous all my years, never late on a bill, never careless with a tool, never failing to keep my house in order. One forgotten switch, one mistake. And suddenly I was incompetent. The balance felt cruel, decades of discipline erased by a flickering bulb. The weight of it pressed hard on my chest. Their case against me was being built, not in courtrooms yet, but in whispers and glances, in the way they carried stories from one room to another. Small lapses, twisted, exaggerated, were stones laid carefully in a foundation meant to bury me alive. I didn't speak of it. Silence had been my shield my whole life, the way I weathered storms. But that night I realized something chilling. My silence was no longer protection. It was their weapon. The morning air carried a bite of late autumn. Frost clung to the edges of my porch railing, and the maple tree in the yard had given up nearly all its leaves. They scattered across the lawn, brittle reminders of seasons passing, of years slipping by quicker than I wanted to admit. Silence lingered in the house, too much of it since Evelyn passed. That quiet had once been a companion, but lately it felt more like a trap. I shuffled toward the mailbox, the chill cutting into my hands. Nestled among the usual stack of bills and advertisements was a thick envelope, heavier than the rest. The seal of the Franklin County Court stared back at me. My pulse quickened. Something about the weight of that envelope felt final, like a door creaking shut. I tore it open at the kitchen table. The words leapt from the page, bold and merciless. Petition for guardianship. I read further, hands trembling. My son, Darian, was listed as the petitioner. Renee, my daughter-in-law, as the concerned witness. The accusations were spelled out in legal ink: evidence of mental decline, unsafe living conditions, inability to manage finances. Each phrase dug into me like claws. For a moment, my vision blurred. 78 years of standing on my own 2 feet, providing for my family, fighting through hardship, and now my own blood had reduced me to a liability on paper. The man I had once taught to fish, to drive, to manage a checking account was now accusing me of incompetence. I gripped the edge of the table so tightly the wood pressed marks into my skin. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. Memories flooded in, unbidden, long nights balancing the books to make sure the mortgage was paid. The pride of building this house brick by brick, watching Darian take his first steps in its living room. I remembered paying his college tuition when money was tight, selling my old truck so he wouldn't carry the burden of debt. I never missed a bill, never let the lights go out. And yet, here it was, my entire history twisted into a narrative of decline. The words on the petition seemed to sneer at me. Incapable, forgetful, unsafe. I folded the papers slowly, slid them back into the envelope, and sat staring at the window. Across the street, Irene Carlo was trimming her rose bushes, her figure bundled against the cold. She looked up briefly and gave a wave, but I couldn't lift my hand. The shame weighed me down. By afternoon, I knew I couldn't face this alone. I reached for my coat, tucked the envelope under my arm, and drove into the city. The courthouse loomed with its gray stone walls, as unyielding as the accusations inside the envelope. I had arranged a quiet visit with Judge Horace Van, an old friend from the church circle. He greeted me in his chambers, his face lined with years of wisdom but his eyes sharp. "Malcolm," he said softly, gesturing for me to sit, "you've got yourself in a tough spot." I slid the papers across his desk. He read them carefully, his brow furrowing. When he finally looked up, the weight in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. "This isn't just routine paperwork," he said carefully, his words chosen like a man treading thin ice. "They're building a case. You need to be very careful." I wanted to protest, to shout that I wasn't helpless, that I still managed my own accounts, my own meals, my own home. But I knew the walls of that courthouse had heard too many pleas already. His warning wasn't just legal, it was personal. Walking out of Van's office, the envelope felt heavier than when I first picked it up. My breath fogged the air as I stepped into the chill, and the truth pressed harder on my chest than the cold. This wasn't gossip anymore. It wasn't careless whispers at church or a cruel remark at dinner. It was strategy. My own son had turned betrayal into a legal weapon. As I reached my car, a fire kindled deep inside me. They wanted guardianship. They wanted control of my life, my house, my name, not without a fight. If they thought 78 meant helpless, they were about to learn otherwise. The paper in my hand wasn't just an accusation. It was a declaration of war, written by my own blood. The drive to Darian's house felt longer than usual, though it was only across town. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than I should have, steadying myself. The court petition still weighed heavy in my jacket pocket. Its edges creased from where I had folded it and unfolded it too many times. Stepping out of my car, I took a deep breath of the crisp evening air. The leaves had nearly all fallen, and the barren branches scraped softly against the sky as if warning me of what waited inside. When Renee opened the door, her smile was rehearsed, brittle. "Dad, so glad you made it," she said, but her eyes flicked briefly toward Darian, as though confirming some silent plan. The house smelled of roast chicken and garlic bread, homey, welcoming, but the warmth didn't reach me. Something darker lingered in the air, almost like smoke from a fire not yet visible. Inside, the chatter hushed for a moment when I entered. Caleb darted over, giving me a quick hug, his innocence a small balm. But even in his excitement, I caught the faint repetition of words he had heard. "Grandpa, don't forget where your seat is." He meant nothing by it, but it hit like a jab just the same. The dining room table gleamed with polished silverware, wine glasses catching the glow of the chandelier. Yet one detail made my chest tighten. At the far end of the table, Near the kitchen door and the trash bin sat a single chair pulled slightly apart from the rest. I didn't need to ask whose place that was meant to be. I held my head high and said nothing as I walked to the table. The scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor echoed louder than anyone else's polite laughter. Renee cleared her throat and waved toward a man I hadn't met before. "This is Dr. Lionel Carrick," she said smoothly. "A close friend of ours. He's been so kind, taking an interest in Dad's health." The man was in his 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a navy blazer that looked too deliberate for a casual dinner. He extended a hand. His grip was firm, practiced. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Riker. I've heard a lot about you." I simply nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. Something about the way Renee said his name, Doctor, like a badge of authority, made my stomach churn. As dinner was served, conversation moved easily around me. I ate little, preferring instead to listen. At one point, Dr. Carrick set down his fork, reached into his briefcase at his side, and pulled out a folder. Renee leaned forward, eager, almost glowing. "I know this isn't really dinner talk," she began, feigning hesitation. "But since Dr. Carrick has been helping us keep an eye on Dad, I thought it best to share." She opened the folder and withdrew several typed pages, clearing her throat as though preparing for a performance. "Preliminary observations," she said. "Signs of memory decline. Instances of unsafe living conditions, leaving lights on, misplaced keys." Each word was like a stone dropped in a well, echoing deeper and deeper. Caleb glanced at me curiously, as though the report confirmed whispers he had already overheard. Darian didn't meet my eyes. I forced myself to sit still, though every muscle ached to push back from the table. I wanted to tear the paper from her hands, to shout that it was all lies. But instead, I let silence wrap around me. If they wanted me to explode, to prove their case, they would not get it tonight. Then came the final insult. As the plates were cleared, everyone shifted in their chairs, and I noticed again how my seat had been placed. Not just at the far end, but squeezed against the wall, near the trash bin. A subtle gesture, but deliberate. It said without words, "You are no longer part of the center. You are being pushed out." Laughter rose from small talk, but I heard it differently, edges sharper, tinged with mockery. My hands remained steady on the table, but inside, a storm brewed. I studied their faces one by one. Renee's smirk masked as concern, Darian's avoidance, Carrick's calm detachment, Caleb's innocence flickered in confusion, caught in the middle. They believed silence meant surrender. They mistook patience for weakness. But as I sat there, the humiliation etched into every detail of the evening, resolve hardened in my chest. Every laugh, every whisper, every paper on that table was a brick in the prison they were building for me, and I would not let them finish it. The morning sunlight crept in through the kitchen blinds, cutting sharp lines across the old oak table. I sat there with my coffee, its warmth steadying me after another restless night. The silence was short-lived. Darian's footsteps broke it, brisk, heavy, as if he had rehearsed this moment. "Dad," he said, standing over me with that folded brow he once used as a boy when begging for an allowance. "We need to talk about your accounts. It's time you let me manage them." The words were calm on the surface, but his tone had the bite of a command. I set my cup down slowly, meeting his gaze. "My accounts," I repeated, as if the phrase itself could shield me. "You mean the same accounts I worked a lifetime to keep balanced? The ones that kept food on this table?" His jaw tightened. "You can't keep up with all the bills anymore. Renee and I think it's best if you sign over access. Just a safeguard." It was dressed as concern, but every syllable stripped me of dignity. I let the pause stretch until the tension filled the air like a storm about to break. "I'm not signing a thing," I said finally, voice steady but low. His eyes flickered with irritation. He wasn't used to resistance. That was the first crack of the day. By mid-morning, Renee made her entrance. She swept into the living room with her perfect posture, the air around her smelling faintly of perfume and strategy. Darian lingered nearby, pacing. "Malcolm," she began sweetly, Yesterday you left the garage light on again. She said it with that rehearsed tilt of sympathy, but I caught the sharp glint behind her words. It's little things like that. Dear, we just worry about your safety. Darian stopped pacing and looked at me, suspicion creeping into his eyes. Renee had planted her seed right where she wanted, between father and son. I clenched my hands, nails pressing against my palms. A forgotten light bulb doesn't erase 78 years of standing on my own 2 feet, I answered, but Renee smiled, unshaken, turning to Darian as though I'd confirmed her point. Do you see? He gets defensive. That's another sign. The cruelty wasn't in her words alone. It was in how she aimed them, using me as the exhibit, Darian as the judge. Later, I stepped outside with the phone in hand, pacing the backyard like a man cornered. I dialed Caleb. Hearing my grandson's young voice gave me a flicker of hope. Grandpa, he answered, a little breathless, probably from running around. Caleb, I said carefully, your dad's been telling you things about me, about forgetting. Is that what you believe now? There was a pause, long enough for me to feel the sting before the words even came. I don't know, he muttered. Dad says you need help. Mom says you get confused. His voice was soft, uncertain, but it carried the echo of their lies. My chest tightened. I wanted to shout that I was the same grandfather who taught him to ride a bike, who patched up his scraped knees. Instead, I just whispered, remember what you know of me, Caleb, not what they say. The line went quiet before he mumbled goodbye. I lowered the phone, heavier than it had ever felt. From the porch, Irene had stepped outside, holding her gardening gloves. She didn't pry, only gave me a gentle nod, as if to say she understood more than I dared speak. That afternoon we sat together on the porch. Irene's voice was soft, steady, like the rustle of leaves around us. You can't let them take your pride. Malcolm, she said, age doesn't erase who you are. Don't let them make you smaller than the man you've always been. Her words anchored me. For a moment, the storm inside eased. I realized not every voice around me was poisoned. Some still carried truth, still reminded me that I wasn't alone. Evening came, and the house filled with that tense quiet before a fight. Dinner sat untouched on the table when Darian slammed his hand against the wood. This is madness, he shouted. You're paranoid. Dad, you can't even admit you need help. You're unfit to keep managing things. The words struck like a hammer. Renee sat beside him, nodding with feigned sorrow, her eyes never leaving me. Something in me snapped. My own hand came down hard on the table, rattling the plates. Unfit? The word burned in my throat. I raised you. I built this house brick by brick. I buried your mother with dignity. And I kept this family alive. I will not be dismissed like some worn-out tool. The room froze. For the first time, my voice rose not in quiet endurance, but in fury. Darian's expression hardened. Renee's lips curved into that faint, satisfied smirk. This was the confrontation they'd been steering toward. I pushed my chair back, heart pounding, the silence after my outburst ringing louder than the shouting itself. I walked away from the table, leaving them in that silence. My legs trembled, but not from weakness, from rage held too long. In the stillness of the hallway, the phone rang. I picked it up with a shaking hand. "This is Judge Van's office," the voice on the other end said. "He asked us to call regarding the concerns you mentioned." The message hung in the air like a lifeline, or perhaps another storm on the horizon. The house had been quiet for hours, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Papers were spread across the desk in my home office, the yellow glow of the lamp spilling over them like a watchful eye. Old receipts, tax returns, mortgage statements, and letters I had kept for years, proof that I had always managed my life with care. They used to be just clutter from a man who liked to keep things in order. Tonight, they were shields. Every whisper from Renee, every glance from a neighbor, every look of pity at church pushed me here. They had turned silence into a weapon, and I finally understood silence would no longer serve me. I ran my fingers over the brittle paper of a 30-year-old loan payoff. I remembered the day I mailed the last check. The pride of knowing the house my son grew up in was finally mine. Now, that history was being rewritten as evidence of a fading mind. By morning, I knew what I had to do. The attorney's office was a modest brick building downtown, tucked between a pharmacy and a cafe that had been there since my working days. I walked in quietly, gripping the envelope Renee and Darian had forced on me with their lies. A young receptionist gave me a polite but distant smile before leading me to a small office. The attorney, a man not much older than my son, adjusted his glasses as he scanned the documents. "Mr. Riker," he began, voice steady but serious. "This is no small matter. Guardianship means losing control of your decisions, your finances, your property, even your medical choices. If a judge accepts these claims, you will not be allowed to live independently." His words struck with more force than Darian's insults ever had. To hear it so plainly, that my life could be taken from me on paper, was like feeling the walls of my home shift inward. "They claim mental decline, unsafe living, inability to manage money," he continued, setting the petition on his desk. "Do you understand the weight of these accusations?" I nodded, though anger had already risen to cover fear. "I understand. And I won't let it stand." He studied me for a moment, then gave the faintest smile. "Good. Then we start by gathering evidence that proves the opposite. Records, statements, anything that shows you're managing your life." As I left his office, the spring air carried a sharpness that felt almost cleansing. For the first time in weeks, I had a plan. But Renee had her plan too. It started with a whisper at church that I had misplaced money meant for the collection plate. By the time I walked into the grocery store later that week, the story had already spread. 2 women I'd known for years paused mid-conversation when they saw me, their smiles laced with pity instead of warmth. "He's slipping," one murmured, just low enough to pretend I couldn't hear. Every step down those aisles felt heavier. The man who had balanced books for his company, who had saved every dime to send his son to college, was now being painted as a forgetful fool who couldn't handle a few dollars. "They're not just after my assets," I thought bitterly. "They're after my dignity." That night, determination hardened into habit. I began keeping a small notebook, jotting down every call I made, every bill I paid, every repair I completed. I checked the locks twice, marked the times, and left the notes where they could not be ignored. My checkbook balanced to the penny, receipts lined up in neat rows. I wasn't just defending myself in court. I was building a memory for Caleb. Someday, when he looked back on his grandfather, I didn't want him to see the caricature Renee and Darian were shaping. I wanted him to see a man who stood tall even as the years pressed down on his shoulders. It was close to midnight when the phone rang. The sudden noise cut through the quiet house, startling me. The screen showed an unknown number. For a moment I considered letting it ring, but something inside urged me to answer. "Mr. Riker?" a voice asked. Low, deliberate. "Yes." "You don't know me, but I have information about your son." I gripped the phone tighter, pulse quickening. There was no more sleep in me now. For weeks, I had been beaten back by whispers and paperwork, by the faces of those who doubted me. But in that voice, I heard the first hint of a crack in their wall, and I intended to tear it open. The night after that phone call stretched longer than any I could remember. Sleep never came. Every creak of the house, every shadow against the window blinds pulled me back awake. By the time dawn touched the curtains, I felt hollow but sharper than ever, as though the worry itself had burned away what little rest an old man needs. I drove downtown, hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. The cafe I chose was quiet, tucked on a side street where the smell of roasted beans clung to the air. Inside, the morning crowd thinned out quickly, leaving a few college kids with laptops and a pair of businessmen whispering near the counter. My eyes darted to every face, every stranger who might be watching. Then he appeared. 40s, plain shirt, thinning hair. He looked like someone you might forget the moment he walked past. But when he stopped at my table and quietly said, "Mr. Riker, my name's Tom. I used to work with your son," the tremor in his voice told me he carried something heavier than small talk. We sat in silence for a beat before he leaned in. "Years ago, Darian asked me to alter records, withdrawals from your accounts, numbers that didn't add up. He said it was just to smooth over mistakes, but I knew better. I've kept copies." From inside his jacket, he slid a folder across the table. My throat tightened. Flipping through those papers, I saw dates, amounts, and signatures forged with a careful hand. It was my name, my money, reshaped to look like incompetence. Tom's voice cracked when he added, "He's building a history, Mr. Riker, a trail that says you've been slipping for years." For a moment, anger lit me up from within, anger so fierce it almost felt young. But alongside it came something else, vindication, proof that I wasn't imagining the conspiracy tightening around me. When I returned home later that afternoon, a different kind of chill met me at the door. My office door was ajar. Papers littered the floor, drawers pulled half open. At first, I thought my exhaustion was playing tricks, until I bent down and found a stack of bills, marked unpaid, though I knew I'd cleared them weeks ago. Alongside them sat notes scrawled in shaky handwriting, as though meant to mimic my own, saying things like, "Can't remember to pay electric." The realization cut deeper than any document at the cafe. Darian or Renee had been here, planting evidence inside my own home. My sanctuary had been violated. That night, I sat at my desk with my late wife's photograph propped in front of me. Her words came back like a whisper. "Whatever you do, Malcolm, keep the family's name clean." I pressed the papers flat on the desk and thought of Caleb. How would he remember me? As the grandfather painted senile by lies, or the man who once carried him on his shoulders through autumn leaves? I couldn't let them rewrite me. Not for Caleb. Not for Evelyn. Not for myself. The decision hardened inside me like concrete. I would fight with every scrap of strength left. I would document, record, gather every witness I could. Silence had been my shield. But now it was their weapon. Just as I steadied myself, the phone rang. The caller ID showed the county courthouse. I picked it up, already braced for the worst. "Mr. Riker," the clerk's voice said briskly, "this is to notify you that your guardianship hearing has been expedited. The date is set for next week." My chest went cold. They were pushing, tightening the noose before I could breathe. For a long moment, I stared at the floor, the receiver still warm in my hand. Then a whisper escaped my lips, steady and sharp. "They want me cornered before I can breathe, but I still have fight left in me." If Darian thought age had dulled me, he was about to learn that silence doesn't weaken a man, it tempers him. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and stale air. Every step with the cane echoed louder than I wanted, as if my frailty was being broadcast to every stranger's ear. Rows of benches lined with spectators turned their heads in near unison. Some eyes were curious, some were pitying, but most seemed to carry the weight of judgment before a single word had been spoken. At the front, Darian leaned close to his lawyer, whispering with the smugness of a man already celebrating. Renee sat beside him, her chin lifted high, a faint smile playing across her lips. That look told me she thought this day would be the end of me, an old man signing away what was left of his name and life. Judge Horace Van entered, his black robe trailing like a shadow. He adjusted his glasses and glanced across the room. For a fleeting second, our eyes met. His gaze held a stern neutrality, but underneath, I sensed a reminder of our quiet conversation weeks earlier. "This isn't just paperwork." The clerk called the case, and the hearing began. Dr. Lionel Carrick was the first to take the stand. He strolled in with an air of polished confidence, carrying a slim folder. His white coat had been replaced with a tailored suit, but the performance was the same. Renee clasped her hands as though salvation itself had entered the room. Carrick cleared his throat and began reading from his notes. "Based on my observations," he said, "Mr. Riker displays early signs of memory decline. He has forgotten household responsibilities, left unsafe conditions unattended, and shows diminished ability to manage his finances." Every word was like a nail hammered into a coffin I wasn't ready to lie in. He spoke of lapses, inconsistencies, and concerns, each phrase carefully crafted to paint me as a danger to myself. I wanted to stand, to shout, to tear the papers from his hands, but I didn't. Instead, I watched, calm on the outside, while inside a storm rose. Years of raising Darian had taught me one thing. Anger shown too early was ammunition handed to the enemy. Then Darian stood. His voice carried across the courtroom with the practiced sincerity of a salesman. "Your Honor," he began, "we're not here to attack my father, but to protect him. These unpaid bills," he lifted the staged receipts high, "prove he can no longer keep up with even the simplest tasks. We found notes in his handwriting admitting forgetfulness." Gasps and whispers rippled through the room. Renee bowed her head dramatically, as if overwhelmed with sorrow, while I sat in silence, my fists clenched beneath the table. To them, I wasn't a father who had paid mortgages on time for 40 years, who had balanced accounts to the penny. No, in their story, I was already reduced to a feeble shadow, but I knew the truth, and I had come prepared. When my turn finally came, I rose slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. The cane steadied me, but my voice, when it came, did not waver. "Your Honor," I said, holding up the folder given to me by the stranger in the cafe, "if my son insists on presenting papers, then let's examine all of them." Judge Van nodded, and I laid the documents out carefully. Withdrawals, signatures, discrepancies. Each page was a mirror reflecting Darian's greed. "These records," I continued, "show funds taken in my name, not by mistake, but by design. I request the court verify them with the bank itself." A murmur swept through the room. Some spectators shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in closer. Darian's face flushed. Renee's smile faltered. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tide turn. Judge Van leaned forward, eyes scanning the pages, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice even, but edged with weight. "This matter requires verification. Court will recess until we can review these documents with the appropriate records." The gavel struck. The sound carried more than finality. It carried suspicion, and it wasn't aimed at me. Across the aisle, Renee gripped Darian's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. Caleb, sitting between them, looked at me. His eyes darted with conflict, torn between the voices whispering in his ear and the grandfather he had once known. For a heartbeat, our gazes locked, and I saw the boy I had taught to fish, to ride a bike, to trust his own 2 hands. I lowered myself back into my seat, whispering under my breath so only I could hear. Truth takes longer to walk in, but once it enters, it cannot be shut out. For the first time, their wall of lies trembled. I knew this was only the beginning. The recess would not end the war, but it cracked the foundation, and once cracks appear, walls never hold. I knew the walls they built with lies were beginning to crack. The silence in the house that evening pressed heavier than the gavel in the courthouse. After Judge Van had called the recess, there had been a moment, a fleeting crack in the wall of lies Darian and Renee had built, but the weight of it lingered long after I left. My cane tapped against the familiar sidewalk of the neighborhood I had walked for decades, but each step felt different now, as though the very ground no longer belonged to me. Across the street, Mrs. Callahan, who I once helped repair her porch steps, shifted quickly, pretending to adjust her mailbox when our eyes nearly met. 2 men by the corner stopped their hushed conversation the moment I passed, and one of them cleared his throat with an awkward force, as though to cover the whispers. These were people who once waved, smiled, asked after Evelyn and me. Now, their silence carried judgment. Renee's venom had spread well beyond the courtroom walls. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and old oak. A comfort and a sorrow rolled into one. I hung my coat on the rack, tracing my hand along the same hook Evelyn used for hers. Memories flooded, summer barbecues with neighbors filling the yard, kids running across the lawn, laughter spilling through the windows. I had been the man people turned to when a pipe burst or a fence needed mending. I was the one who quietly slipped $20 to the young couple down the street when their baby came early and money was tight. Now, those same people averted their eyes. Years of trust built with sweat and decency, reduced to whispers about forgetfulness and failing memory. One rumor, repeated often enough, erases the truth. Across town, in the home I had built for my son before he abandoned gratitude, Darian was boasting. Though I wasn't there, I could imagine the sneer in his voice, the sharpness in his words. Caleb was there, though. He sat in the hallway, his small hands curled into fists, listening as his father mocked my courtroom performance. Darian's voice cut through the walls. The old man trembled like a leaf. Judge Van will see it for what it is. He's unfit. He can't even remember to pay his bills. The words struck Caleb differently. He had heard enough to know what love sounded like, and this wasn't it. In his young heart, something shifted. Doubt crept in where blind faith in his father once stood. Later that night, my phone rang. Caleb's voice was a whisper, fragile but fierce in its courage. "Grandpa, I don't believe everything Dad says." The silence between his words carried more strength than any witness I could summon in court. It wasn't just comfort. It was hope. For the first time in weeks, I felt my heart lift, not because the battle was won, but because I wasn't alone in it. My grandson saw through the mask, even if only a little. I sat by the kitchen window long after our brief call ended, watching the branches sway against the dim streetlight. The night was quiet until a faint scrape drew my attention. An envelope slid under my front door, landing with a sound that felt louder than thunder. My hand shook slightly as I bent down to retrieve it. The note inside was written in sharp block letters. "They won't stop until you're gone." I stared at it, the words burrowing into my chest. Gone. Not incompetent, not retired, not diminished. Gone. This wasn't just about papers and signatures anymore. It wasn't just a courtroom struggle. For the first time, the full truth pressed into me with brutal clarity. This fight wasn't just about assets. It was about survival. Sleep never came that night. The note lay on my nightstand, its words etched into me. "They won't stop until you're gone." I stared at it until the ink blurred in the dim lamp glow, wondering whether it was a warning or a threat. By morning, my body was heavy, but my mind sharp with unease. 2 days later, the courthouse hallway was buzzing. The polished floors reflected every hurried step, every anxious glance. At the far end, I caught sight of Renee crouched beside Caleb, whispering as if she were sharing a secret. Her hand rested on his shoulder, her smile practiced and sweet. But I knew better. I could almost hear her words from across the hall, planting doubt, rehearsing lines, twisting innocence into a weapon. Caleb's small frame stiffened, his eyes flicking to me and then back to the floor. The gavel's rap brought us into the chamber. The air was tight, thick with expectation. Darian stood tall beside his attorney, papers clutched as though they were swords. His gaze locked on me with the confidence of a man convinced the finish line was in sight. I sat quietly, cane resting by my chair, my silence a shield stronger than any outburst. "Call the witness," the bailiff announced. Caleb shuffled forward, every step a stab into my chest. My grandson, my fishing partner, my Saturday pancake helper, was now a pawn. Darian's voice, steady and coaxing, guided him. "Caleb, you've seen Grandpa confused, haven't you? You've heard him forget things, haven't you?" The boy hesitated. The silence was a long crack of thunder waiting to break. Renee leaned forward, nodding, urging him to speak. Caleb's lips parted. "Sometimes," he whispered. Murmurs rippled across the room. My heart clenched. The poison had reached him, but then his small voice wavered. "But he remembers too. He never forgets fishing. He never forgets my stories." His eyes lifted toward me, wide and wet. Darian's jaw tightened. Renee's smile froze. The judge leaned forward, brow furrowing. Is that all, son? Caleb nodded quickly, retreating like a bird seeking shelter. Renee's eyes flashed daggers in my direction. The manipulation had failed to bloom fully, and she knew it. I stood when it was my turn. My voice was steady, not raised, but heavy with truth. Your Honor, my grandson knows me better than these papers ever will. He knows the promises I've kept. Fishing trips, stories, birthdays. Those don't vanish with age. They stay because they matter. My gaze lingered on Caleb, and I saw the faintest flicker of pride in his face. Before Darian could retake the stage, Judge Van's voice cut the air. Mr. Riker, he said, eyes narrowing at my son. Your filings have inconsistencies. He tapped a stack of papers. Financial records that don't align, withdrawals unaccounted for. Perhaps you would like to explain. The confidence in Darian's posture faltered. His lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically. But Darian's face flushed red. For the first time, he looked cornered, not victorious. The room shifted with whispers, the balance tilting, however slightly, in my favor. When the session adjourned, I walked out lighter than I had entered. And the truth had spoken in flickers, in Caleb's hesitation, in the judge's sharp questions. For a moment, I allowed myself the breath of hope. But when I reached my porch that evening, hope shattered into glass. There on the wooden step lay the picture frame that had once sat proudly on my mantel. Me, my late wife, and a young Darian in happier years. The glass was cracked, the frame bent, as though someone wanted me to see love broken into pieces. I bent down slowly, the weight in my chest heavier than the cane I leaned on. My fingers traced the jagged edge, and I whispered into the cooling night air. They want to break me from the inside out. And in that moment, I knew the war wasn't confined to the courtroom. It was in every corner of my life, reaching into the walls of my home, clawing at the memories I held dear. The broken glass from the photo frame still glistened faintly in my memory as dawn crept across the blinds. All night I had stared at that empty space on the wall, the picture of me, my late wife, and a young Darian now reduced to shards. It felt less like an accident and more like a message. We can break even your history if we want to. That morning, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, Renee stood there with a smile too polished to be real, holding a folder close to her chest. "Good morning, Dad," she said in a tone dripping with sweetness. "I thought I'd bring you something important. Dr. Carrick has completed some affidavits. They make things clearer." I could hear the blade hiding beneath her velvet words. She wasn't here to visit. She was here to threaten. She tapped the folder lightly. "You see, the court doesn't always need to wait for things to unravel. When doctors provide evidence, the law moves swiftly, for your safety, of course." My jaw tightened, but I didn't move. Instead, I studied her. The way her fingers clutched the folder just a bit too tightly, the faint tremor in her hand, she was nervous. "Funny thing about paper, Renee," I finally said, my voice calm, measured. "It only tells half the story. The rest, well, I've made sure I'm not standing alone in this." For the briefest moment, her smile cracked, the mask slipped, revealing eyes sharp with calculation and fear. She quickly recovered, but not fast enough. I had seen it. She knew I wasn't going to fold. "Suit yourself," she said, turning briskly and walking away. "But the court won't be so forgiving." Her heels clicked against the porch steps like a ticking clock. That afternoon, the courthouse smelled of polish and dust, the air heavy with judgment. I entered with my cane steadying me, head held high. Darian and Renee sat close together, whispering with their attorney. Across the aisle, Dr. Carrick adjusted his glasses, shuffling papers like a magician preparing a trick. When Judge Van called the session to order, Renee stepped forward, handing over the documents. "Your Honor," she said sweetly, "these affidavits show that Malcolm suffers from progressive cognitive decline. Dr. Carrick has observed troubling patterns." Carrick stood and read from the papers, his voice smooth, rehearsed. Forgetfulness, unsafe independence, inability to manage complex finances. Each word was a nail they hoped to drive into my coffin. But Judge Van's brow furrowed. He leaned forward, tapping the documents with his pen. These are unsigned evaluations. No full examination is documented here. This court requires more than hearsay. Mrs. Slayton. A ripple spread through the room, murmurs, shifting feet, whispers of doubt. For once, the tide did not run entirely against me. I rose slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance, then faced the room. I've been paying bills on time for 50 years, I began. I kept a roof over my family's heads, paid for my son's college tuition, and managed the church's finances without a penny missing. These hands, I held them up, calloused and firm, built the home my children grew up in. If this is what decline looks like, then perhaps the word has lost its meaning. The courtroom grew quiet. I saw heads nodding. Even strangers seemed moved. Caleb, sitting next to Renee, lowered his eyes, but I caught his glance, conflicted, yet proud. For the first time, I felt the air shift. The image they had painted of me, a doddering fool, was beginning to blur. That evening, back at my house, the silence pressed in heavy. I shuffled up the porch steps, weary but not broken. Something white caught my eye. A plain envelope lay at my door. No name, just one word stamped across the front. Confidential. Inside, a document slid into my hand. My breath caught. It was stamped with the seal of the county clerk's office, estate transfer, and at the bottom, Darian's signature, scrawled, but unmistakable. Except it wasn't his hand. I knew every loop and curl of his writing. This was a forgery. The heat rose in my chest, a mix of rage and grim satisfaction. Proof, finally, proof. I held the paper against my chest, whispering into the emptiness of my living room. The war was no longer just about defense. It was time to attack. The morning light was thin, cold against my skin as I buttoned my coat. Inside the pocket rested the envelope, creased from the nights I had held it tight in my hand, like a soldier clutching a final weapon before battle. Every step toward the courthouse carried the weight of betrayal and memory. My cane struck the sidewalk in steady rhythm, not weakness, but resolve. The courthouse loomed tall against the pale sky, its windows glowing with the sun that was finally breaking through. I paused at the steps, remembering Evelyn's words, "Dignity is the only inheritance worth leaving behind." With that thought, I tightened my grip on the cane and pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the room hummed with whispers. Renee sat upright in a tailored dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap as though she were attending a church service. Darian leaned toward his attorney, his voice sharp but low, the kind of whisper I had known since he was a boy trying to lie about broken windows or missing money. Caleb sat in the row behind, his eyes flicking nervously between me and his parents. The bailiff called order, and the session resumed. Darian's lawyer stood first, dramatizing every word. He painted a picture of an old man slipping, stumbling, forgetting. He spoke of a grave responsibility to protect me from myself. Renee added her soft performance, sighing about late-night worries, her tone dripping with false concern. To the crowd, they looked like a loving family trying to do the right thing. I stayed quiet. Silence was not surrender anymore. It was a mirror, reflecting their desperation. Then came my turn. Judge Van looked at me from the bench, his expression unreadable but steady. The years etched in his face reminded me that he, too, had seen families ripped apart by greed. I rose slowly, my cane tapping against the floor, the room watching each step as though they expected me to collapse. Instead, I reached into my coat and placed the envelope on the clerk's table. "This," I said, my voice low but clear, "is the truth they've tried to bury." The clerk passed it up to the judge. He opened the envelope and pulled out the document, his brows tightening. It was stamped confidential, estate transfer. My signature, or what looked like it, bled across the page, but it wasn't mine. The date was impossible. The notarization sloppily forged. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Darian shifted in his seat, sweat rising on his forehead. Renee's smile froze, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the armrest. "Mr. Capel," Judge Van said, his tone sharp. "This bears your submission. Explain." Darian stammered, his words tangled. It must be a mistake. Dad probably signed it and forgot." The judge's gaze did not waver. "The ink is fresh. The notary's stamp is invalid. Do you take me for a fool?" Renee tried to interject, her voice shrill. "He doesn't know what he's saying. Malcolm can't—" "Enough!" Judge Van's gavel struck, the sound echoing like thunder. "One more word, and you'll be held in contempt." The silence that followed was broken not by lawyers or witnesses, but by Caleb. His small voice carried more weight than any legal brief. "I heard him," Caleb said, standing, his cheeks flushed. "Dad laughed about making Grandpa look crazy. He said nobody would believe him. He said it was the only way to get the house." The room stilled, every face turned toward the boy, and for a moment, even Darian was speechless. Tears burned at the edges of my eyes, not from weakness, but from the sight of truth breaking through a child's courage. I nodded to Caleb, no words needed. Judge Van leaned back, his expression grave. "The guardianship petition is dismissed. Furthermore, this court will initiate a formal investigation into fraud and forgery." He turned his gaze on Darian and Renee, his voice sharp as steel. "You sought to strip a man of his dignity for greed. Now you will answer for it." The gavel struck again, sealing the verdict. The courtroom erupted, some in murmurs of shock, others in whispers of disgrace. Renee buried her face in her hands. Darian sat frozen, pale and rigid, his empire of lies collapsing. Caleb crossed the aisle, his steps small but steady, and leaned against my side. I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of something I thought I'd lost. Hope. When we stepped outside, the afternoon sun poured over the courthouse steps. It felt different this time. Not just light, but absolution. The crowd parted, some ashamed of what they had believed, others quietly nodding in respect. I gripped my cane and inhaled the crisp Ohio air. Caleb walked beside me, matching his small steps to mine. "They tried to take everything from me. My name, my voice, my worth," I whispered, my words carried by the wind. "But in the end, truth is the inheritance I will leave behind."